This is Joel Kotkin.
And this is Marshall Toplansky.
And you're listening to the Feudal Future podcast. Our society is being rapidly reduced to a feudal state, a process now being exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Millions of small businesses are near extinction. Millions more are losing their jobs, and many others will be stuck in the status of propertyless serfs. The big winners have been the expert class of the clerisy, and most of all, the tech oligarchs, who benefit as people rely more on algorithms than human relationships.
With this, around the world, the middle class is becoming more squeezed than ever, and it's having profound economic, social, and spiritual implications. Here on the show, we're having conversations with business, government, and citizen leaders like you to get to the core of these issues and explore how we can work together to form a better future than the one we're headed towards. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we're delighted to have three guests to talk about the topic of reshoring. We have J.R. Turner, who is managing director of the Americas for Novacell, which makes films and coatings for various industries. It's part of Chargeur, which is a French conglomerate. Michelle Comerford, who is industrial and supply chain practice leader at Biggins, Lacey and Shapiro, a consulting firm specializing in competitive relocation strategies. And Harry Moser, founder and president of the Reshoring Initiative, a national nonprofit group on the issue of reshoring and foreign direct investment. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Great to be here.
Yep. Maybe just to get started, one of the big issues that, and I know this is somewhat part of your expertise, Michelle, but that fundamentally we now are in a world that, as Marshall suggested, is very interconnected. But we're seeing this, let's say, with the semiconductor industry, where we can no longer produce the critical semiconductors. And the question is, are we going to be in the situation where every time something goes wrong in a critical foreign economy and in a place that dominates something like medical equipment with China or semiconductors with Taiwan, are we going to see supply chain collapses, price rises, and all that? Is this sort of the wave of the future, and is there anything we can do about it?
Yeah, no, it's certainly a hot topic right now. One thing the COVID pandemic did was really shine this bright light on how fragile global supply chains are. And we've certainly have seen disruptions over the past decade or so related to natural disasters, but a global pandemic really took things to a new level. And so now there's certainly a ripple effect that we're seeing as a result of that. Harry can, I know, talk a lot about the history of how we got here in the first place, but certainly goes back 30 plus years to chasing low wages and things like that shifted a lot of our manufacturing away from the U.S. To cheaper labor markets, frankly, at the time. And we've grown up since then in a lot of different ways and seen a lot of advances in technology, which have an opportunity to shift that, which I know we're going to get into. But right now we're in this sort of gap zone where we're realizing how fragile these global supply chains really are.
Harry, you want to give us a little bit of how we got there? I remember covering Silicon Valley in the 70s and 80s, in which we dominated the semiconductor industry. And obviously now whole industries get brought to a halt because we can't produce things. So how did we get here, Harry?
Primarily the difference in manufacturing cost and FOB or ex-works price between the U.S. and offshore. So we've done surveys, others have done surveys, and we conclude that 70% or so of the decision to buy imported product instead of domestic product is price driven. We can buy it there for 20, 30, 40% less than here, therefore we'll go there. And so then the question is, why is there so much of a difference in manufacturing cost there from here? And it comes down to the dollar being 20 or 30% higher than would be determined just by trade in goods. It's driven high by the dollar being the reserve currency, for example. We don't have the skilled workforce of a Germany that allows you to have high wages and still be productive. We don't have a value-added tax. For most of the last decades, our corporate income tax has been the highest in the world. So we've got all kinds of things that mitigate against investment, skilled workforce, productivity, and therefore competitive prices. And so if we want to successfully bring back semiconductors, EV batteries, all these things that everybody's talking about now, we have to get U.S. manufacturing costs to be competitive.
Well, let me ask you about that, because there's been an evolution from originally just trying to find low wage arbitrage to the countries that have grown up as a result of having gotten the increased business and now are more mature themselves. Are they competing now on things other than labor cost, manufacturing value add? Are they innovating? Are they tougher competitors than they used to be?
China specifically is not as tough a competitor as it used to be. 40% of the reshoring that has happened in the last 10 years has been from China. And the Chinese, specifically the Chinese wages have gone up at 10 to 15% per year for the last 15 or 20 years. Now their productivity has gone up very rapidly also, but not as fast as the wages. So even before COVID, even before the trade wars, work was flowing out of China. And so
let me get JR in on this a little bit. So you're in the business. My sense of your business, which is the coatings and film business, it's a relatively automated and machine focused business, right? I mean,
it's typically more capital intensive than it is labor intensive. I mean,
so what are you experiencing as far as reshoring, or in terms of where you decide to put a plant in order to be competitive?
What we typically look at is what market we're trying to enter. So if, for us, localized speed flexibility is a critical differentiator for us to win business. So being that we are, a French-owned company, we started out in France and in the European-centric, decided to get into the U.S. market and expand the Americas. So we made a direct investment, initial presence in the early 2000s, and have done acquisitions since to expand our capacity and our footprint. So it's really looking at the markets that we're participating in and having a physical presence for us to compete with our competitors. It's the main driver right now beyond price is lead times. How can we quickly service and match the demand that's growing right now?
So what you're really saying is that there's no overarching desire one way or the other to place plants in one place or another, other than from a Franco-centric perspective, wanting to put as much in France as possible because it's a French company. But there's no kind of overarching, let's move to the US or let's move to someplace. It's really local market conditions are driving those decisions.
Correct. Typically continental structured. So we look at emerging markets. If we look at Asia, India is the emerging market for our business that we're looking to enter. So putting together a strategy for entrance into that market. So it really is market driven for us from where we want to gain share and want to grow our business.
Well, I think this is very important for the discussion because, there's kind of an underlying expectation from an American-centric perspective that somehow we should have business refocused on being focused in the US, right? Because when the US started to gain industrial dominance and we became the 400-pound gorilla in the world economy, our own patriotism clicked in, right? And we said, hey, we're the place. Is this no longer a factor in sophisticated global management of companies?
So Marshall, what I think Jared's describing there, and to answer your question, is a trend we're seeing with some of our clients, which is regionalized production strategies. So being closer to the markets that you're intending to serve. So rather than one mega plant to serve the whole globe, you have multiple regional serving manufacturing plants.
Which
And
makes sense. It
that
makes
helps
sense
eliminate
because you're going to
that
reduce
lead
your overall
time.
cost of getting things to market. But from an expectations of Americans' perspective, right? America is no longer necessarily the largest market for things. The population and the discretionary income to buy things is slowly shifting to other countries as they mature. So is it reasonable to think that we will be able to actually maintain kind of industrial dominance, or is reshoring really realistic?
Well, first, U.S. is no longer the largest industrial economy. China produces really 30, 40, 50% more than we do. So we're not the biggest manufacturer, but we are still the biggest consumer because they make it, we buy it. Okay. And so I think in the long run, I have to believe that work will come back. Well, first, perspective. When we started in 2010, in that year, 6,000 jobs were announced to come back. Last year, 160,000 were announced. This year, we expect over 200,000 announced to come back. Okay, so there's been a wonderful upward trend like this over the last 10 or 12 years. So the trend is in the right direction. And in the long run, the U.S. will not be able to continue to have a $900 billion per year goods trade deficit and a trillion or multi-trillion dollar budget deficit, because the rest of the world won't accept that. And eventually the dollar will collapse, and then the U.S. will be competitive again. So one way or the other, the U.S. will be competitive. And so the question is, do we wait for the collapse and have it happen? Or does the country and do the companies manage that and make smart decisions now, acting in their own self-interest by doing the math, by calculating total cost of ownership instead of just looking at the wage rate or the FOB price? And so we say doing the math is the right decision.
But maybe I want to just ask Michelle for a second here. When you consult with companies, do you find a greater consciousness of their self-interest, or is it still we can save 10 cents and I can earn another $20 million bonus if I slash everything here and put everything in China or someplace else? Is there any change in the corporate consciousness, Michelle?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a balance. Cost is still really important. However, what has gained in importance, as Harry calls it, the total cost of ownership, is also factoring in those risks. Okay, so what if you can make something for 10 cents? If you can't get it to the US to get on the store shelves, then you've got a huge problem. So those kind of risk factors of disruption to get your parts, your supplies, your final product, whatever the strategy is playing in at a larger weight than it did previously.
You're really saying it's the strategic side of this is popping up more now. I suspect COVID has probably exacerbated that, right? I mean, the people are probably looking at the fact that, oh, gee, we didn't have the right parts for ventilators, or we didn't, have the right reagents for the COVID tests because we don't control the supply chain around those things. Is that kind of calculus beyond the math? Are we seeing a lot more of that?
Yep. Yeah, well, so the medical products and the pharmaceutical ingredients, that really has become a matter of national security and defense. So that's kind of another thing we can talk about. But then for other companies, I mean, I just saw a picture, I think this week, of over 200,000 trucks sitting in Kentucky waiting for semiconductors before they can get out to the car dealers. So there's all kinds of different disruptions here, from the pure consumer side to the actual critical nature, health and defense of our country, where these risks are just really top of mind for different executives and for our federal government, frankly.
JR, how has this affected your business?
I think Michelle described earlier. I mean, it's really allowed us to assess where we've got a fragile part of our supply chain. I mean, if 2021 was a year of reflection, it was definitely on supply chain management. And we're looking constantly to evaluate how we can strengthen it, make it more flexible. Part of that's localizing it. I mean, we have a fair balance of importing versus domestic supply chain the way we're set up today. We're trying to increase that domestic supply chain part as much as possible, install more capacity, but also find partners that we can rely on in the future, because we've seen so many disruptions come through, whether it's on the freight side, whether it's on labor shortage, whether it's on price increase. Supply chains have been really tested the last 6 to 8 months, and even the best have seen issues that they have to address. And so we've got to be proactive in what we're going for. We've got a lot of work ahead of us over the next couple of years to make it more robust, so we're not here again and the next time it comes through.
One good source on this is Thomas, the group that used to put out Thomas Register, and they've done surveys every couple of months on this. And the most recent one, they put out a big report on North American supply chain, and 83% of companies were seeking more North American suppliers, primarily US, but also Canada and Mexico. And the single number one criterion by which they were making the decision was total cost. Whereas if you'd gone back a year or two ago, they almost surely would have said price was the main criteria.
That's very interesting. And, I suspect too, that when you start looking at the total cost of ownership or total cost equation, you have to factor in the cost of stockouts for inventory, right? So that that suddenly dials up the need for having a proximal group of suppliers.
That's one of the factors in the TCO estimator, which is our online system for people to do the calculation.
And if you want to see an illustration of this, go down to Huntington Beach, where I take the dog because there's a dog beach there. And you can see a line of ships waiting to get into LA Long Beach Harbor that is just astounding. I mean, it's worse than the 405. And so, the bottom line is, how long are we going to allow ourselves to be in this? And is there any change? Trump made a big deal about reshoring and things should be in the US. And then Biden was elected, and I think a lot of the corporate types who backed Biden may not have, supported some of his policies. Is the Biden administration committing itself on this issue? I mean, we haven't had an administration focused on this in a long time. I mean, Trump, ranted and raved, but I don't know how much he actually did.
So Biden is clearly more organized about it, more statesman, more statistical sort of about it, more data driven. But we see him primarily, his administration primarily applying tourniquets. So, for example, we have major problems with chips. And so they're going to give tens of billions of dollars to companies to build chip factories here. But it's been recognized that because our labor costs and other costs are high, our chips will be more expensive than the chips coming out of Taiwan and China. And so the risk is that we'll go from having being dependent on China and Taiwan for chips to being dependent on China and Taiwan to buy our chips to make the computers and the cell phones and the systems that are made over there, because we don't make them here because our costs are too high. So we advocate for the Biden administration to take the actions necessary to get the manufacturing cost in the US down. Easiest thing is lower the dollar. And by doing that, then more TVs, more cell phones, more servers will be made here, and there'll be a market here for the chips that are made by the factories that they've subsidized. So if you just
interesting, Harry, because for people who are not into economics and understand the underpinning of currency costs and stuff, that most people would think, well, the simplest thing to do is cut wages, which has been kind of the contested element, right? Nobody wants to cut wages. So what you're saying is, no, in order for us to become more competitive, we need to manage the dollar better. What else do we need to do?
Well, as I said before, get the dollar down by 20 or 30%, have a value-added tax. Other countries When we ship something to China, they tax it 15% coming in. Their exports to us get a 15% credit, which makes them more competitive over here. So dollar down value added tax. Don't raise the corporate income tax because that makes the after-tax return on investment here worse. Most important, absolutely essential, have a skilled workforce like Germany. Have the apprenticeship program, the engineering program that Germany has, so that we'll have the most efficient factories in the world. Germany has wages as high as ours, and they have a trade surplus equal to 5% of their GDP, and we have a trade deficit equal to 3% of our GDP. Main reason, skilled workforce.
JR, how is that in your company? You've been expanding. We're in the midst of a terrible labor shortage. We just did a program on it. What do you do from a company level to address this labor shortage, which is something that I've been working on quite a bit?
Absolutely, Joel. I mean, next to our supply chain challenges, labor is our next hottest topic in our business. In all of our facilities across the U.S., we've seen gaps, and we've had to really change the way we recruit. We attract our talent, getting them plugged in different programs that we wouldn't traditionally get involved with, to really scour and find that talent that, where we can pull in that pool and train. Also looking at our training programs, how we be more effective in getting that new pool of talent into our workforce, get them trained, give them appropriate skills so they can start adding value to our process. So it's been very tough out there in the labor market. And, we've seen the shift really, for people wanting to come to a factory job, they really wanted to go into manufacturing. I saw a statistic that I think by 2030, there's going to be about 2 million manufacturing jobs vacancy. That's going to account to a couple $1 trillion in lost revenue. So we really got to figure out, from an industry standpoint, how we connect back into the high schools, the trade schools, and make manufacturing attractive again.
This is something
using that audience at a young age.
This is something we totally are focused on ourselves. We've had some shows on this and agree with you that it's an issue. Is it an issue everywhere? Michelle, when you hear JR talk about the labor shortage problem, it makes me wonder whether or not it's equally distributed across the United States. As you advise clients, are there some places where A, labor, and B, the taxation and business climate are such that the costs are lower?
So I have been a site selection consultant for over 18 years now, working with manufacturers on their location strategies. And first of all, I am the busiest I've ever been in my career in terms of interest in manufacturing investment in the US. But I also have never seen the labor markets across the country in the shape that they're in right now. And I talked earlier about the ripple effect of the pandemic, and this is one of the huge ones that we are watching closely, trying to, every week take in the information. Some of it certainly has been due to the unemployment benefits that were extended, the federal level, and then some of the states. As some of the states have started to end their additional amount, those areas have seen an increase in applicants for open positions, but it's been slow. And so we're kind of watching this. We're trying to advise our clients about, the probability of success. These are big, multi-million-dollar investments going into the communities where they need to know that they're going to have people to work in these facilities going forward. And so one of the biggest indicators that we are really honing in on is these, and it really is localized, but the communities and the areas where they have focused even before now, they have sort of at least a little bit of a history on getting young people exposed to manufacturing opportunities early. They have strong community college partnerships and training centers that work with existing industry to customized training and offer programs, and are really showing the potential of a pipeline of workers. So that's what we're talking about here it's now that's important, but also going forward. And so those areas that have that are really coming to the top of our list, and that's where you're seeing a lot of the new announcements more recently are those kind of communities. It's such
Which
a hot
areas
and important issue.
Which areas in particular?
So, as I said, it's very localized, So, in general, we're seeing some great examples of it across the Midwest, across the Southeast, places that have a history of, I would say, manufacturing and industry, but have also recognized the need for workforce early on, and have had that business and workforce partnership mentality for many years. Those are where the strong programs are. There's a number of other examples that are getting on the train now, and I think we're going to see more communities improving in that. But it's just a huge location factor right now in our work.
Anybody who's interested can get some good data at MSSC, Manufacturing Skills Standards, I think it's Coalition, and they have an index for each state and each community within the state of the number of credentials being awarded in manufacturing. So you can go in there and find some interesting data to see where and some states are doing very well, others are not doing so well.
Say that again, Harry. It's MSSC?
MSSC, I think it's Manufacturing Skills Standards Coalition. There's several other organizations, NIMS, others that put out excellent credentials. So this isn't the only one, but it's the one that's been most aggressive in making the data available on a geographic basis. Mm-hmm. So it'd be worth looking at. Another thing that I'd like to kick in, the Labor Department is very counterproductive on this subject. If you go on Labor Department and you look up anything about earnings and wages, you always get earnings by degree level. No high school, blah, blah, up to PhD, okay? And it's clear earnings go up with number of degrees. And I convinced them once on one site, and I'm trying to convince them on their other sites to put in there the average earnings of someone who's passed an apprenticeship or has 5 or more certificates of some kind, because statistics show that those people are making just as much as the bachelor's degree. But the guidance counselor, the high school teacher, the parent, professors who write about this, they always look at this one chart that has the bar chart and its degrees, and it's like, and there's no other alternative. And
right, and the logic is well, you have to get a bachelor's degree because
you have to get the degree.
And in fact, what we're finding with students is that not really.
You have to get skills.
The students coming out of our programs are getting okay jobs, but these are not, they're above burger flipping, but it's hardly, I think manufacturing careers are paying far better.
Yeah, I mean, like we find Marshall and I have worked on the space industry here in California. It's one of the last strong industries we have. Those people who are working, building those spaceships, who are machinists and welders, they're doing very, very well. So it seems that the big problem, it seems to me, is that we've sold our young people a bill of goods. Well, if I get a degree in advanced consciousness from Cal State Fullerton, the world is going to come rushing in to offer me a job. And that really isn't happening. And actually, in the data that we're looking at now, exactly as Harry suggested, people with technical degrees, 2-year degrees, certificates do better than the 4-year degrees. And what we're finding, and there's a very good piece in City Journal about this now, is that and Harry, you didn't mention it, but that same person who goes to the 4-year college and maybe gets a graduate degree is so in debt. Whereas I assume that if you go to, let's say, Ohio, to a skills training place, how expensive is it going to be relative to, as a parent about to send my youngest to college? It's enough to make you want to move to a different country.
Well, if you go into an apprenticeship program, you're getting paid a decent livable wage as an apprentice, and the company is typically paying the tuition for you to go to community college and get the technical courses that you have to take.
Yeah, JR, do you have that set up in your company?
I was going to mention that. I mean, a lot of companies now, tuition reimbursement. I mean, for our own technical team and our maintenance team, we're upskilling them and we're covering the costs. I mean, the amount of shortage that we're going to see specifically in manufacturing for trade skills, electricians, millwrights, welders. That's a huge trend. That was already an issue prior to COVID, before kind of this major labor gap we're seeing. And it's only accelerated as a sense. And as we see the kind of the boomer generation retire out, a lot of those skills, 40, 50 years of electrical work, of maintenance work, that we're struggling to find a backfill for.
Yeah, for real tribal knowledge that makes
Marshall,
businesses really work.
Yeah, Marshall, you asked, what can the U.S. do, to help support, manufacturing growth, and this is one of those key areas. We've seen a couple states try to take it in their own hands. Tennessee offers free community college to all its residents. I believe North Carolina is now, and so there's some states sort of leading this charge. But and I do think that it's probably best handled at the state level. But in terms of federal funding towards what we're talking about here, this would be an enormous return on investment to invest in people financially, and then having a cultural shift, educating the guidance counselors in the high schools to understand these opportunities. So they are helping and the parents, of course, but helping kids. Four-year college isn't for everyone, and there's a lot of great opportunities, as we've said here, in manufacturing careers. So helping to guide young people into those career paths is just as important as the dollars.
Well, and to be fair to our current administration, I think that they're actually quite focused on that. I think this is a priority for the Biden administration to provide greater access to education. But I've got a question that's kind of like the elephant in the room about reshoring, and that is inflation. So, Harry, you talk about let's drop the currency by 20% in order to be able to make America competitive in that arbitrage. What about inflation? Aren't we worried? Certainly the government's going to be worried that this is going to translate into massive inflationary period.
First, it would not be massive. To put it in perspective, I mentioned this TCO estimator that we have to do the calculation, and I took the first 180 cases of China versus the US, where a user had done the calculation, and from their data, we conclude that in about 8% of the cases, the US had the lowest price, but in 32%, we had the lowest total cost. So we conclude that about 20% of what's now imported from China, and even bigger percentages from Europe, could be brought back and not raise the consumer price, and the company be equally profitable or more profitable. So the first 20 or 30% of imports can be brought back with no impact on inflation, and 20 or 30% of imports is on the order of $700 billion a year, which is roughly the size of our trade deficit. So as a first approximation, we could get rid of 3/4 of the problem with zero inflation. And then if you want to get rid of all of the trade deficit, you'd be digging into some items where the cost is. So the real reason to cut the dollar is to get the companies to focus on doing it. Because if we could get them to focus on doing the math without cutting the dollar, they would do it on their own. But I have, in 11 years, I have failed to convince them to bring back 5 million. We've only got them to bring back 1 million so far.
Well, that brings up the question of what's next. What do you guys think is going to play out here? What's your predictions for the future?
This year is very good. This year is booming. Go ahead, Michelle.
Well, I'm going to tie in a question you asked earlier, Marshall, about the administration focus, and the Trump administration had, as a result of COVID and again exposure to the fragile supply chains related to our medical products, formed a funding, really actually through the Department of Defense, program to reshore some of those really critical items, PPE, pharmaceutical ingredients, et cetera. And that program has continued through the Biden administration. That was one that they did not cancel, and they have awarded some grants towards that. So As far as reshoring some of these critical items, we're seeing it. We're working on some projects specifically related to that effort. And so that kind of support, certainly at the federal level, is key. You know, I think as from a defense standpoint, you know, we can't find ourselves in a position again where we can't protect our own residents. So that, I see that continuing. And some of this, you know, support is important to help that. So it kind of takes out some of the typical, you know, total cost of ownership comparison, and it's giving it additional fuel to accelerate it. Then we see it with some of our, you know, we're such a reliant society now on technology. So arguably the semiconductor industry, it should be right there with it, or could be, you know. So seeing how critical some of these items are to the success of our own economy, as long as our government continues to prioritize some of that, we're going to see that, and others may follow, just for some of the other reasons we've talked about, which is the benefits of being closer to the markets you're going to serve, to eliminate some of those risk factors, to respond better to consumer demands, to be flexible to what they want. So we're seeing still a pretty high upswing on reshoring activity in the near future.
JR, how does it look for you? For your company?
I think you're seeing a lot of companies focusing on supply chain. If they hadn't focused on it before, they're definitely focused on it now. I think commercially, what we're preparing for is customers that were single sourced are no longer going to be single sourced. That they're going to be looking for second and third sources, right, to hedge any type of risk in the future. Companies that weren't focusing or investing on their workforce, they're going to be focusing now. They're going to be looking at alternative strategies. You know, the same tricks and tools aren't working. So how do we look at new ways of recruiting a workforce and making them add value? The other thing we're seeing is consolidation in the industry. You know, companies are sitting on excess cash at the moment. That's cheap. So we're seeing companies being bought out and less players, let's say, out there. So let's say family-owned businesses, prime time to sell their business. So we're seeing a lot of mergers and acquisitions out in the industry, and that's changing the supply chain landscape as well. So a couple of those things coming through, but the supply chain effort and the labor force are not going to be a short-term issue. It's things that we're going to be battling for the next couple of years.
Yeah. And Harry, last word to you. Where do you see this going?
Well, again, this year is booming. It's been very good, significantly helped by the Biden administration. Companies have been burned, and you know, one thing that is a real risk. China often talks about decoupling. So I've got some friends who are sinologists, and they're convinced that China is so mad because of Taiwan, Hong Kong, what we've done about the Uyghurs, the trade war, Trump, et cetera, that China at some point in time, within months maybe, might say, we will not ship anything to the United States. I mean, total embargo on shipments to the United States. Now, is that a 1% chance or a 10% chance? I don't know the answer to that. But if I were a company and my business was 100% dependent on product coming in from China, critical components and so on, I wouldn't take that risk. I'd find at least I'd go to Vietnam or Cambodia or somewhere else, but I'd bring a significant portion, at least one source of key things back to the United States. Because if the Chinese ever did that, you know, they invade Taiwan, we do something, they shut us off, and your company is entirely dependent on those products, you're out of business. You're bankrupt.
Yeah.
And the country's destroyed. So in the interest of the company, in the interest of the customers of the country, it makes sense to bring a reasonable portion of most everything back to the United States just to avoid those risks.
Well, that's a scary thought.
Yes.
You know, it's interesting to think about whether that really would happen, whether they'd want to cut themselves off from their market in that way, which I find is kind of unrealistic. So I don't think I'm going to lose sleep over it, but it is a scary prospect. But, you know, first of all, thank you to the three of you for really a stimulating conversation, you know, where we came out here, as we've talked about, the need for a complete change in our approach to education. focusing more on vocational education, need to look at the currency, need to look at continued ways of helping companies get more control over their supply chain. So you've helped to highlight these issues, and thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that this is a discussion that should be going on. And what's encouraging to me is it's one of the very few issues where you find many Democrats and Republicans in agreement. And I think, you know, you can have a Sherrod Brown in Ohio and you can have a Rob Portman, and they're going to support some of the same things. So anyway, given the fact that not everything has been working out so great in the rest of the world, at least there's something maybe positive here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you.